Greetings, folks. So, what you just saw is an example of AI animation, and that's exactly what I'm going to try and cover in this video. I wanted to give you an overview of how this type of animation works and how you can create some animation using various AI tools that are out there. So, the one that I'm going to cover in this video is called the Deforum Stable Diffusion. It's a flavor of Stable Diffusion. It uses 1.4 version. One thing I should mention that most recently Stable Diffusion has upgraded to 1.5, but Deforum Stable Diffusion hasn't upgraded to 1.5 yet for its weight. But I don't truly anticipate a huge difference when it comes to 1.4 versus 1.5 as it relates to animation. So the look and feel should be more or less the same. So if you were to learn how to use Deforum Stable Diffusion for 1.4, I would assume that it should feel exactly the same when they upgrade to 1.5. That being said, let's jump straight into it. All right. As I mentioned in the introduction, we are going to use Deforum Stable Diffusion to create our animation. And the nice thing about Deforum Stable Diffusion, it allows you to either use your prompt or prompts, text prompts, or it allows you to use your own video to create animation from that. Now, before we jump in and start executing each block of code, a couple things need to be in place. First of all, you need to have access to Google account because you need to have access to Google Drive. Why? Because that's where we're going to have to save the checkpoint file, the stable diffusion checkpoint file in your Google Drive. That's indicated here right on top that you need to save that checkpoint file for stable diffusion 1.4 version 1.4 here. And I'm going to show you exactly how it's done. Now, the way you get that though, you get it from Hugging Face. And in order for you to access that file from Hugging Face, you also need to set up your account with Hugging Face. Very easy. All you do is just provide your name and your email address and create your user ID and password, then you're good to go. So assuming that you have both, you have the Google account set up to have access to Google Drive and you have access to Hugging Face because you have created your profile, I'm going to show you now how you're going to download that one file. By the way, once you download it once, that's all you need to do. Every other subsequent execution, every time you come back and recreate some animation, you don't need to worry about it because guess what? The file is already there. By the way, I'll have both the Deforum Stable Diffusion version 0.5 URL as well as the Hugging Face where you have to go to get that file, that URL. I'll have them both in description below. Okay, so let's just assume that you have access to that link because I have it in the description. So you click on that link, you scroll all the way down, you see SD version 1.4, that's Stable Diffusion version 1.4 checkpoint. So you click on that and it just starts downloading it, assuming that you already set up. Now, what had happened the first time I came here, I wasn't aware. Don't be surprised if you're prompted to provide your user ID and password the first time. So the first time you come in, it will prompt you to provide with the user ID and password for Hugging Face, which you already have created. So you just have to type it in and then it starts downloading right from there. So it's doing it right now. It's a large file, it's 4 gigs. So it might take a little bit of time for it to download the whole file. And where it downloads is in your downloads folder. And we'll look at it in just a moment. So if I go back into my download folder right now, I don't see anything here. If I refresh it, I can see that it's currently in the process of downloading it because I don't see the name of that file yet. And you'll notice that it's sitting at around 1.5 gigs. And if you remember that it is actually 4 gigs that's going to get downloaded. So let's just give it some time and we'll come back and look at the file once it's completely downloaded. Okay, now we can see the name of the file. That means that it's completely downloaded. It is quite large, 4.1 gigs, and it's in your download folder, which is all great. Now, that's the first part. What you need to do, you now have to upload that, what you just downloaded from Hugging Face. You need to upload that into your Google Drive. And let me just go back in here. So if we come back to our Deforum Stable Diffusion, and if we scroll down a little bit, and mind you, we haven't executed anything yet, where it says model and output paths, you'll notice that model path, which is just a checkpoint file we downloaded, should be under Google Drive under a folder called AI/models. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you exactly where it is. I go back in here and I go into my Google Drive and I go into my drive, which is where we are at. And we are looking at here, my drive AI/models. And it is case sensitive, so you have to keep that in mind. So if you go back in here, you should have a folder set up called AI models. See, I have two. One is the small letters models. So if I double click on that, as you can see, I already have the checkpoint saved up, right? So I'm not going to go through the exercise of uploading it here, but I'll show you exactly how it's done. So once you're there, once you have created a path, and the way you do it is you can go new and you can create a new folder here. That's how I created this folder, which is the AI folder. Then I double click on it, similar to your Windows File Explorer. You just create a folder called models. And that's where, once you have created it, so let's say you are in that model subfolder, all you have to do at that point is upload that file. And the way you do it, anywhere in here, you just right click and you say file upload. Here it's just going to go back and bring back your file explorer. So all you have to do is just refer back to your download, click on it and open it. And that's how you're going to upload it back into your Google Drive. So now that you have it, we can safely close all of the links other than our Deforum Stable Diffusion. We are ready now at this point to start running it. So just run the first block of code. You'll get that same warning that we have seen for other versions of Stable Diffusion. You just say run anyway. And that block is done. Now that we have it saved, that file, so we have the model saved, we are safe to run the second block of codes. Let's do that right now. Says connect to the Google Drive. That's how it's going to access that checkpoint file. You just say connect and allow it to connect. So you have to log in with your Google account. Scroll all the way down and just say allow. So now it's connecting to your Google Drive to access that checkpoint weights file for Stable Diffusion. Might take a little bit of time. It's already done. Took about 30 seconds. So now it found the file, which is all great. Now we are ready to run that setup environment block. So just click on that. If you remember, anywhere you see a play button, you just click on that to run that block of code. Setting up the environment right now. And the way you know that it's done, you'll see a green check mark right next to it. And until it's done, it's just going to clock. May take a little bit of time. You may get warnings like that where it says you're connected to a GPU runtime but not utilizing the GPU. Just ignore that. I'm just going to X out of that for now and let it complete. All right, so looks like the setup environment block is complete. So now we are ready to run that next block, which is Python definitions. Let's just run that. setting up that, and it didn't take too long. Now you're going to load this checkpoint model for this specific version to use that. So let's just click on that to select and load the model. And we'll come back once that block of code is complete. We'll start with the settings, which is where we have to go into a little bit of detail so you know what some of those options are. And there is a cheat sheet, which I'm going to have a link in the description for as well. So you know how you can tweak some of these settings, some of these parameters to create what you want. And that's one thing I should mention, that when it comes to animation, just as with your image generation, text to animation is a bit more involved in terms of the parameters. And you need to, it's a lot of testing and playing with the different parameters to get what you want. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, that you need to have some sense of what those parameters are so that you get exactly what you're looking for, hopefully something close to it. All right, so now that the select and load model block has been executed and we see a check mark there, which is all great, we are actually ready now to go through the settings block. As I mentioned, that there are quite a few parameters, and we'll try and cover some of the basic ones. Now, I also previously stated that there is a cheat sheet which I came across. It is quite handy. And anytime you're creating your own animations, I strongly recommend that you refer back to that cheat sheet. And I'll have the link in the description, as I previously mentioned. This is how it looks. So once you are in that link, and let me just scroll up all the way to the top, it has a nice table of contents. So anytime you have any questions and you're not certain as to how to use a specific parameter, not that you have to experiment with every single one of them each time you generate an animation. I don't necessarily think that's the case, but you can always come here and look at the settings here. So you can just come here and you can just click on any one of those options and it'll take you right in that block. That being said, let's just go back to our Colab for Deforum Stable Diffusion, and let's start selecting our options here. So the first thing we'll do, we'll just select the animation mode. Now, in this example, I'd like to go with a 3D option. So let's just pick that. Now the max frames, and I actually went through this exercise to decide what are some of the options I should select. Maximum number of frames. By the way, if I were to go back to our cheat sheet here, and we go, either you can search from here, from the top, and if you scroll all the way down, that's another option for you. Right after setup, there should be an option for animation settings. Okay. And they have two sections. One section has a high level overview, and then the second section actually goes through a bit more details. So if you have more questions, you can always refer back to that. So here they're talking about the animation mode, and we have, what we have here is 2D, 3D, and video input. If you were to use a video as opposed to creating from text prompt, so that's an option there. And I'm hoping that my follow-up video will cover the video input option. But in this one, we're going to use text to animation. So I'll use a prompt or a set of prompts to show you exactly how animations are created. But I'm going to use 3D in this case. The max frames, and that's the one I wanted to show you. So if you're not sure exactly where it is, you can do a search for that specific parameter. It says max frames, the quantity of images to be prepared for stitching. So number of images that are going to be generated. So in this case, I want to limit, just for the sake of time, I'm going to limit it to 500. So that's the number of images that will be generated. And by the way, these images that are going to be generated along with your ultimately your video output, the animation output, they're all going to be saved into your G Drive, Google Drive as well. So that's another reason you need to have the Google Drive, because everything gets saved there. Now the border. Okay, so for the border, I'm going to keep it as replicate. There are two options here. I'm just going to say replicate just to keep it simple. And many of these options I'm going to leave it to the default just for this example here. Now angle and zoom, they're not relevant for your 3D animation. They're only applicable for 2D animation. So irrespective of what values are there, they're not going to have any impact because we're working with 3D. So we'll just leave it to the default values. Now, translation X, when you first come in, you'll notice that they have this neat formula that's already there by default. But what I noticed with translation X, which by the way applies for 3D animations as well as 2D animations, translation X and Y, I chose to change that to 1 because I noticed that when I kept it to the default value, it wasn't generating the animation the way I wanted to, because what translation X does, and again, we can go back and forth. If I go and search for translation X, and now we can go here and look for what they are, it says in 3D mode only. By the way, it also, in this cheat sheet, it also gives you the range of values that are acceptable for each one of these parameters, which is neat. So translation X, it moves left to right, your animation, right? So positive translation X shapes the camera to the right. So if you have a positive value, which we are going to have in this case, is going to shift the camera to the right. And I'm not going to go through every single parameter in detail, the descriptions. That's why I'm going to include that link in the description so you can take your time and you get familiarized with all of the different options here. Otherwise, it's going to be quite a long video, and I don't want to necessarily bore you with all of the parameters. So if you have the time, you're more than welcome to look at each one of those parameters and what they do. For translation Y, I'm going to leave it at 0 and 0. And this one, I believe, takes you up and down in 3D mode. Let me just check. Translation Y, yes, it does. Takes you up and down. And the Z, translation Z, brings it forward or backward. So it does some sort of a zooming effect. So just as a high level overview, those are some of the parameters here. So let's just keep moving along because there are many parameters that we need to go through. Translation Z, I chose to reduce it to 2. So the zooming effect, I wanted it to be less. Now the rotation, 3dx, 3dy, and 3dz, they're applicable for 3D, as you can see from the parameter names themselves. And what I'm going to do for rotation X, I'm going to leave it to the default value of 0. For rotation 3dy, I'm going to change that to 1. And for rotation Z, 3dz, I'm going to leave it to the default. Quickly, just to show you what those rotations are for, I'm just going to do another quick search, and it brings back the table of contents here. So you can click from there so you know exactly what those things are. So rotation 3dx, as I mentioned previously, that it only applies for 3D. And the values can be between -3 and 3, measured in degrees. It rotates the camera around the x-axis. And for y, rotates the camera around the y-axis. And for z, rotates the camera around the z-axis. I think there are some neat diagrams here somewhere in this cheat sheet, which I'm not going to show you right now for the sake of time. But again, you have that. You can refer back to that and look at how those rotations work. Now let's just go back. So we're leaving it to 0 for rotation 3D Z. All right, so now the next one, flip 2D perspective. This section doesn't have any effect for 3D animation because just as the name suggests, it applies for 2D. So unless you have selected 2D as an option and you have selected this option here, then any of those subsequent parameters do not have any effects. The perspective flip parameters, they are all applicable for 2D. And what it does in a nutshell, it tries to mimic some of the 3D effects in a 2D type animation. So that's all it does. But again, because we're working with 2D or rather 3D, doesn't have any impact at all. Okay, so we're going to jump into noise schedule. Let's see what I have decided to have as a noise schedule. Okay, for noise schedule, I'm going to leave it to 0.02, strength schedule 0.65, so I'm not touching any of them. Contrast schedule, I'm going to leave it to the default as well. Now, for color coherence, I chose to leave it to lab, match frame 0 lab. There are other options here, HSV and RGB. And in that cheat sheet, just switching over to the cheat sheet quickly, I'm going to go under color coherence, and it's here. And it says, it gives you some details, right? So it tells you which one does what. But one thing I remember when I read through this cheat sheet quickly, it says, lab is a more linear approach to mimic human perception of color space, a good default setting for most users. So that's why I decided that I'm going to leave it to the default value of lab for that parameter. So that's great. So we're good there. Now, diffusion cadence, from my understanding, is relatively new in one of the newer versions of Deforum Stable Diffusion. And what it does, there should be a section here. I'm just going to search for it. Yes, right in here, it's talking about the diffusion cadence. And what it does, it controls the frequency of frames to be affected by the diffusion. I'd recommend that you read this section because it is pretty neat what it can do with this diffusion cadence. And it's a small section, but it clearly states exactly what it does and what are the values that you can enter. So for example, with the default value of 1, it says it will cause every frame, every image in your animation to receive diffusion in the sequence of image outputs. So that's the default value, right? That's the way. Now, if you were to select a value of 5, what it does, it diffuses the first frame. It draws 4 non-diffused frames or images, followed by another diffused frame, which would be your frame number 6, right? So the total output in this case will be 5, of which 1 is diffused, the following 4 are not. So play with it if you have the time, and you see different types of effects depending on the value that you select for diffusion cadence. So yeah, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on this so that you have some knowledge on that. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to leave it to 1 because I want each frame, each image within my animation to get the same diffusion effect. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Now, depth warping is another section where you can spend a little bit of time. As the name suggests, it does warp the frames, the images, and the values. By the way, this section is also explained in details in that cheat sheet. So I'm just not going to cover that for the moment. But what I decided to select for my values is the defaults. So the Midas weight, I'm going to leave it at 0.3. FOV, I'm going to leave it at 40. Padding mode, I decided I'm just going to leave it at border for this example. I'm not going to switch to reflection. And sampling mode, I'm just going to leave it at default value of bicubic. So they're all good. Now, video input, if you were to use a video as opposed to a text prompt, this is where you refer the video input path. You first have to save it up into your Google Drive. And by the way, as I mentioned before, I hope to create another video covering on this type of animation where you're actually supplying a video and it just animates that video. So that will be a subsequent video. So just leave it for now because it has no impact. Interpolation, I'm just going to leave it, and resume animation. If you want to start resuming animation from a certain point in time, then you can do that by tweaking some of these values here, right? So I'm not going to do any of that for our purposes. So I think we got all of them covered. So what I'm going to do now that we have all the different options selected, 3D, 500, maximum number of frames, and we have changed some of the parameters or replaced some of the parameters, I'm going to run this block of code. And that should go quick because all it does, it saves your parameter options here, right? So that's what you're doing here by running this block of code. It's all done. So here we get into the juicy stuff. This is where we're going to start working on our prompt settings. So this is where we're going to provide our prompts. And the prompts that I decided to work with are the animation prompts, obviously, because we are not generating images, still images. We can ignore that piece and we are going to generate animation prompts. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now, a few things you can do. You can always remove anything that you see in that animation prompt section by default. And that way nothing gets done, or you can just comment them out. I'm going to, in this case, just comment them out by adding that pound or hashtag. So that's done. Now, here is where you start adding your prompts so that you can tell the model exactly what type of animation you want to create. And the way this works, very simple. It starts from 0, and after 0, it keeps using that same prompt to create the frames that are related to that prompt up till the next prompt line. So for example, in this case, it's going to use a beautiful apple trending on Earth Station. It's going to keep creating animation for that prompt and keep generating the frames up until frame number 20, where it's going to switch to that next prompt. So just to keep it simple, what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete prompts 30 and 40. We don't need them. I'm going to limit it to just 2. I think it was here. I don't think it matters. I'm just going to take it back to where it was. And the prompts that I'm going to use, just the 2 prompts that are going to be used in this case are, let me just go back in here. And I'm going to simply copy and paste the prompts. So my first prompt, I'm going to replace that with my own prompt, which reads, people screaming deep at night next to a graveyard, horrified with what they just experienced. Edward Munch and Beksinski, brutalism, octane render. I wanted to, because we are getting close, very close to Halloween, I wanted to use some horror animation as an example here. You can use your own example or anything that you want, anything that you like. Now the next prompt, I'm going to change that to dawn has arrived with a beautiful sunrise and happy people are walking down the street next to a graveyard. Octane rendered, keeping the theme more or less similar. Unreal Engine, hyper-realistic concept art. So I wanted to switch it back after a certain number of frames to more of a happy scene. And if you remember, right on top, we decided we're going to use maximum 500 frames. So what I decided, I'm going to split it in half. So I'm going to use the first 149 frames to create my horror animation, and the next 250 frames to create my happy animation. So let's see how it works. I haven't tried these specific prompts before, so I'm hoping that it does what I'm hoping it should. So let's just click on the run button here, the play button. It's all done. It picked up my prompts. Now this is where you're gonna load the settings. You're going to generate the images using 512 by 512. You can always change that. That's the height, width and height for your frames or images that are going to get created. Now the seed, let me just scroll down and look at what I decided as being the seed. I'm going to leave it at the default of -1. Sampler, leave it to the default value of KLMS. All of those are explained in details in that same cheat sheet, so you can experiment with any other sampler. Steps, I decided to leave it at 50. I think the more steps you have, based on my understanding from that cheat sheet, is going to get into more details in terms of the animation itself. So it will take a little bit of time. That's the drawback. So when you're creating that animation to generate those frames might take longer the more steps you have. But I decided for this example, I'm just going to leave it at default value of 50. Scale, I'm just going to leave it at default of 7. And let's see if I have changed anything else. No, I think all of those are good. It's already selected save the samples. So what it does, it saves it into your Google Drive and save the settings. All great. So I'm going to scroll down because these are all the defaults. You don't have to touch them. Just leave them to the default values. Now the batch setting is where you can change the name. So this is how the subfolder is going to be created in your Google Drive under the AI folder, and that's where all the images are going to be saved. And in our case, there's going to be 500 images that are going to be part of that animation, right? So I'm going to change that to say something else so I know exactly this is my new one. So I'm just going to say horror and happiness. Sure if I typed happiness correct, but I'm just going to leave it at that. And file format is going to generate PNG format, which is all good. I'm not going to worry about any of these. Any settings, I'm not using any custom image, and we can ignore that. So this initial setting refers back to the custom image. If you were to start your initial creation from an image, you can include that here, the path, once you have saved it somewhere, or even you can refer back to any other website image. Here we can see that they have an example here. But again, we are going to let the prompt and the model generate starting from the beginning. So I'm going to leave it. So I don't need to worry about any of that stuff. So here it says create the video. So by default, it won't necessarily create the video unless you uncheck it. So skip video for run all. So what it's going to do, as it creates those frames in that previous block, which we haven't run yet, is going to come and it will create the video once we run that second block of code, which refers to if you want to create the video, but you need to make sure that it's unchecked. And I'm showing you both blocks before we run one by one. And frames per second, it is critical. What it tells you is how many frames you're going to use or you're going to display as part of the animation per second. So I'm going to say it's going to be 10. I just lowered it somewhat. So what it tells me, and if I were to bring my calculator back in here, so what it tells me, because I have total of 500, if you remember, we decided we're going to have 500 frames created, and I'm going to have 10 frames per second, gives you a sense of how long your animation video is going to be, assuming that you're going to use every single frame. is going to be 50 seconds. So that's great. I reduced it to 10. Manual setting, I don't necessarily need to worry about that part, except for I'm going to change max frames to 500. So what this does, if you had a max frame value of 250, remember how we are generating 50 or rather 500 frames, 500 images? It would have used only the first 250. So in essence, it would have generated our horror animation, but it will skip the remainder of that happiness or happy animation, right? So, but I want to include all of them to generate that 50 or 50-second video, animation video. So I'm going to change that to 500. So now we're ready. All we have to do at that point is just run the two sections. So we start running the first block of code first. So I'm just going to say load settings, and it will take some time for it to start creating those images, right? It will take a little bit of time. You'll start seeing those images once it starts generating one by one. So let's see what happens. Now, as we can see that it has started generating some of those images. Looks pretty scary to me. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to end up looking in the end, because I'm letting the model create the animation from scratch. So I don't have any reference points or reference image to start from, but I can see it's working on some graveyards. So we'll see how it turns out. For the moment, it's creating some black and whites. You can play with it and maybe just create something else. I can see some humans. I see it looks pretty scary to me. That's for sure. So let's see how it looks in the end. And by the way, because we have so many and we have 50 steps to create and we have 500, we have to be patient because it's going to take its time to create every single image. And right now it has rendered 15 of the 500 images that we have requested to be created. So we have to give it the time for it to complete. And we'll come back once the entire block of code has been executed. All right, we're back. It took some 52 minutes to complete that block of code that generates out of the frames or the images. We had some 500, so that's how long it took. And here we can see some sample of some of the images that are being generated. The way I know, once again, is because I see that there is a check mark. That means it's complete, and it says right underneath that it took 52 minutes. That's all great. Now, the only thing remaining is to run that video creation from frames. If you remember that we actually set all of our parameters that we want them. So let's just simply run it. All right. Now here, it's giving me an error message. So I think I need to uncheck that render steps from the one time I ran. I remember that I most likely need to uncheck that, and let's try again. So click on run again. So now it seems like it has picked up the command and it's running. So you just have to remember that that render steps needs to be unchecked before you can complete it. Didn't take too long. Took all but 12 seconds to create our animation. So that's all done. And let me show you what actually happens once all of the steps are complete. So if I go back into the Google Drive, and under Stable Diffusion, you'll see that there is this 2022-10, which is October of 2022 subfolder. Under that, there'll be a subfolder called Horror and Happiness. That's the one we created. So if we double click on it, these are all the different images, right? That you can see, some 500 of them. So you do need some space, and I had to upgrade to experiment with some of that because by default, I believe in Google Drive, you get only 15 gigs. That may not be sufficient for you to start generating some animation. So I had to I had to upgrade and pay for increasing my storage capacity. That's all good. And the only other thing I wanted to show you is this is where that MP4 animation is created. So the MP4 is the file, and the way we know that it's been done, let's just play it, and hopefully it created some decent animation for us. Let's just double click on it and let's look at that. Okay, so now it's saying I have to download it. So I'll download, and it's just downloading it. Doesn't take too long for you to download to see how the animation is. So let's look at that right now. So this is how the animation looks. I'm seeing some graveyards here. And if you remember that we are expecting a 50-second, around 50-second, and that's exactly what I'm seeing here. 50 seconds, I see some humans. And right around the 25 seconds, I expect to see some changes to that animation because we changed our text prompt. So looks like it's rotating and it's showing us some people walking in and around the graveyard. And that's the animation. Is it exactly what I wanted it to be? I wouldn't say 100%. That's why you have to experiment with it. Perhaps provide it with a starting point, with an image of a horror type, and then hopefully, it becomes a little easier for that model to understand what type of animation you want to generate from there. Hello, folks. So right after I generated that initial animation that I shared with you guys as we were going through each step of Deforum Stable Diffusion, I realized I can certainly improve that. And the best and the easiest way we can improve our animation outcome is by simplifying the prompt that we are going to provide. So that's exactly what I ended up doing afterwards. I simplified the prompt and I removed some of the parameters that I had, and I ran it a couple more times. So the first time I had it quite simple: people screaming deep at night next to a graveyard, horrified with what they just experienced, advert month. As simple as that. And as soon as I changed that and reran it, I got some decent animation. And this is the animation that I got. Still 20 seconds, but it's way more improved because I simplified that prompt that I initially used. So that's one. Now, if we were to look at the second one, I just added the 4K so that I can get a bit more of a higher resolution. So that's all I added. And that gave me the second animation video. And it's a bit higher, as you can see, it's a bit higher resolution, but I got some decent animation as well. So that's all I wanted to share with you quickly, that simply by changing your prompt, you are going to get a different set of results, because at that point, once you have provided that prompt, you're leaving it up to the model to decide how it's going to generate the animation. So I thought I'll just share that with you, that you can always tweak, you can simplify it, and you can get some decent results. I hope you liked this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.